One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the show today is I was watching, I don't know why I do this to myself, I was watching Real Time with Bill Maher, right? And he's looking back at everything that happened in August, race tensions and the alt-right versus Antifa. And he brings out his first guest and he said, when I saw everything that happened this month, this was the person that I really knew I needed to talk to. And so I was hoping it was you or Glenn Lowry, but unfortunately it was Jesse Jackson, right? And so I'm thinking, well, okay, Bill Maher let me down. At least I'll do a show where I talk to Thaddeus about what happened over the course of August. And before we do that, we might as well announce we are going to be doing another Renegade University and School Sucks Project Present a Weekend with Thaddeus Russell event before the end of this year in Los Angeles, California.
Yes, we are. I'm very excited about it. November 10th to the 12th in Los Angeles, Venice Beach, and at the Reason Studios, which are in West LA. Same format, different topics. We'll also have some local flavor in the form of LA food trucks, famous LA food trucks.
Right.
And we'll do a historical walking tour of Venice Beach, which has an incredible radical and renegade history. And we'll just spend the rest of the weekend doing what we did in Salem, which was phenomenal. We will be talking about issues deeply. We will engage in debate, intense conversation, and we'll get to know each other in ways that I didn't think were possible until the Salem event. It really blew me away. Getting to know people as intellectuals and as human beings, as people, getting to know their life stories and how they connected with their ideas. And also, I learned so much. In fact, I was going to say, I haven't even told you this, that I did a podcast yesterday with Brian Callen, who's a actor and a comic, very smart guy who does a podcast here. He had me on his show yesterday, and we did an hour and a half on postmodernism. And I used the ideas that I got from the participants in the Salem Weekend event. In that, and they can hear it. I'm going to send it to them, actually. They will hear their influence on me. And it really was helpful. It was by far the best conversation I have had. It was my best performance, really. It was the best version of my argument for postmodernism that I've ever given. And it's largely because I had those conversations with those people in Salem. So it was truly a life-changing experience in many, many ways, and including intellectually for me. I think I know they learned a lot, but I did too. So anyway, that's what we're going to do in LA, November 10th to the 12th. And it's going to be, I am quite sure, given the performance of people and given how it turned out in Salem, it's going to be amazing.
All right, so I want to talk about what's on the menu as far as sessions are concerned over that weekend. And again, it's November 10th for VIPs. The regular event is the 11th and the 12th. On Saturday, Extremism, radical movements of the left and the right. I think it's going to be a big part of what we talk about over the course of the next hour or so. But if you want to just introduce that, and then we can move on to the next one.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's what's in the news. That's what we're talking about here. It's right. These things that we're calling fascism and Nazism and anarchism and communism, going head to head in the streets now. And it's sort of, those words are in the media, which is interesting because in my lifetime, this is the first time when those words have been used this frequently, and people have identified either as those things or they've identified others as those things with such regularity. It's in my lifetime until just the last 10 years, pretty much all of popular mainstream media discourse was in a pretty narrow window in which it was liberals fighting against conservatives, or the people who were called liberals and conservatives. And radical ideas didn't get much airtime at all. And I mean, they weren't discussed at all. And very, very few people identified as any of those things, including even socialists. I mean, people don't realize this. I mean, a lot of academics certainly identified as socialists, but they were never on ABC or NBC or CNN until very recently. So now all of a sudden everyone's talking about it. And here's what's very clear to me immediately is that no one knows what they're saying. No one knows what they're talking about. They don't know what these categories are. They don't know what these ideologies are historically or theoretically even. So we're going to do that. We're going to talk about the histories of fascism, Nazism, communism, and socialism. And we're going to compare them to what we're seeing now in the streets. And then talk about sort of how radical ideas like that are labeled extremist the use of this term extremism is a very American phenomenon, and we need to talk about it. We need to talk about how, and by the way, libertarianism is included here. That's often called an extremist ideology. Mm-hmm. And we need to talk about why these ideas are called extreme and what purpose that serves.
Excellent. The other topic that day, well, there's two other ones: race, the history of an idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, of course, that's been sort of the core of my work for a long, long time. So, yeah, we're going to talk about how race has been constructed, the various ways it's been constructed over a couple of centuries, and how, of course, it's constructed and reconstructed now, how Americans think about it. And here's what's going to be surprising. I'm going to present an argument for how the left in particular is most responsible now for reconstituting or reconstructing this very, very bad idea in American history of race. That it's really the people who are doing the most work to make race a reality, which is is originally a racist idea, is people from the left. So it's actually a left-wing project now to make race real, this thing that was constructed by slave owners.
And do you find that it's been a consistent effort by the left throughout at least the latter half of the 20th century right up until today? Or do you just find that it's revived as it is politically useful? Race came back into the conversation very heavily with the appearance of Barack Obama and throughout the Barack Obama presidency. And then I saw, as Hillary Clinton ran for president and, won the Democrat or whatever, obtained the Democratic nomination, race took a backseat to sexism as it seemed to be more politically useful. So obviously, during the Obama years, you could say, well, there's people who support Obama and there's people who don't like him because he's black. The academic Michael
Eric Dyson.
Eric Dyson, right. He was just doing this the other day, saying that, there's people who agree with Barack Obama, and there's people who are racist, and Donald Trump is a racist. So now we're seeing that the race narrative is coming back front and center because it can be useful, it helped President Barack Obama, but now it can be used to hurt President Donald Trump, right? There's people who are against Trump, and there's the racists who support him.
Right. Yeah, so what's happened, and this is not news to most people, but in the last 20 or 30 years, what we call identity politics has become front and center in left-wing politics. And by the way, that's to the chagrin of many of the socialist and Marxist left. They do not like this stuff at all. They want to return to class, which is a real thing to them. And I'm sort of sympathetic to them, at least on that part of it. What identity politics has done is has made race important and real in ways that we're not supposed to consider it to be real. They talk about it as if it is a biological reality, and they act as if their race determines their destiny, and that race determines everyone's destiny, that your race is the most important thing about you. So take Barack Obama, for example. His race, his being black, was considered and still is considered to be the most important and best thing about him. Mm-hmm. That about him being president. That was the most important thing and best thing about him as president. So what does that do? That all that does is continue this idea that was originated, right, by the scientific racists, the very, very bad guys of the 19th century, that race is fundamental, biological, and determines your destiny. The remaking of race as a fundamental reality is what the left has been doing for 20 or 30 years. It's not actually a right-wing project. To me, the so-called alt-right is largely a reaction to identity politics, or I should say it's a reappropriation of identity politics. What they're doing is they're simply using left-wing identity politics, but just changing the categories.
Now, for those people who might be new, this is something that we've dealt with on the show going back years, and you've objected to the term cultural Marxism before, but that's the charge that gets leveled at the left for using identity politics, while there are socialists and Marxists who want the conversation to return to class. The suspicion that people have, and I share this suspicion a lot of times, is that if you read anything that deals with identity politics, sooner or later, capitalism is brought into it as part of the problem. Mm-hmm. It's in race, it's in fat shaming, it's in anything that has to do with gender. And that makes people suspicious. There's been a substitution, that it was intentional, even though it bothers Marxists and socialists. The substitution of these identity issues for class was an intentional way to keep that kind of narrative moving forward, because that narrative was hard to argue. Fall of the Soviet Union, all of the revelations in Solzhenitsyn's book, etc.
There's this tendency to believe there's some sort of conspiracy.
Sure.
Right?
I love that tendency.
Yeah, I know. And this is my life project, is to disabuse you of that, Brett. That there's been this sort of conspiracy among Marxists and postmodernists and the Frankfurt School. It's not true. It's just simply not true. Because why? I know this because I was inside those fights between those groups from the very beginning. When I went to New York, when I went to Columbia in the early 1990s, I was entirely, I was in graduate school. I was a socialist. I was an activist socialist. I was an intellectual. I was hanging out with all these people. I was watching these things emerge. And that's when it was really coming to the fore, this fight. Marxists hated postmodernists, and postmodernists hated the Frankfurt School. And so these are very different schools of thought. There is some overlap, significant overlap between the Frankfurt School and Marxism, which we can talk about, but the postmodernists stood apart from both those camps. So no, there was no sleight of hand, as Jordan Peterson puts it, to sort of use different words for the same Marxist politics and Marxist analysis. These were actually antagonistic and hostile from the beginning. The ideas in them are fundamentally opposite. So,
I think when people don't understand the origins, the impulses obviously push in very similar direction, though, as far as the state is concerned.
So the postmodernists' great contribution, the most important contribution, whether you like it or not, to the way we think about race is that it is a social construct. That's the postmodernist term. So if it's a social construct, then it has no biological reality. It has no economic basis. It has no material basis. That was the whole postmodernist argument. Now, what people have done is what I'm saying. When you talk to social justice warriors now about what their race means, they'll tell you it means everything, that there's nothing they can do about it. There's nothing that we can do about it. This is it. This is it is a fundamental reality that has to be dealt with the way we would deal with the weather.
Right.
We have to adapt to them and their race. We have to accommodate their race. We have to accommodate the needs that come with being of a certain race. This is all biological determinism of the 19th century reemerging in language that is called progressive or left wing. It's quite remarkable. So this is why Marxists hate this stuff, because to them, and I don't agree with them either, but to them, race is what they call an epiphenomenon or a superstructure. It's the stuff that sort of emerges it's the bad ideas that come out of the materialist base of capitalism. That capitalism produces these ideas. Although even there, Marxists have a debate. Some of them don't even think that. They think that we should just ignore race because it is a social construct. It has no meaning, material meaning. And what we need to do, this is actually what most Marxists are saying now. They're saying what we need to do is restructure the material basis of society. We need to bring socialism. And once we do that, in fact, this was Bernie Sanders' argument until the Black Lives Matter people got on the stage with him and started shouting at him. We should definitely talk about this, the history of Bernie Sanders on this. He was a materialist Marxist who was hostile to identity politics and race politics until he was dragged kicking and screaming into the BLM camp. His whole argument was, no. Once we have universal health care and once we have public schools, free public schooling for everyone, there will be no racism. We will get rid of all these problems. That's the fight. My point here is there's a hostility. There's a fundamental antagonism between Marxism and the identity politics that we're seeing on campuses.
Sure. Yeah. And I've talked about that on the show as well. And I explained the split in a little bit of detail. By the way, 2 years ago today, I posted a video on the YouTube channel. It was you and me. And the title of the video is What Libertarians Can Learn from NWA, Black Lives Matter, and Donald Trump. And in the last couple of years, I think we've learned a lot. I don't know if it was the lessons you wanted people to learn, but we mostly talked about respectability politics, and the Bernie Sanders versus BLM was sort of the focal point of that video. Mm-hmm. So we did actually tease the postmodernism topic, which is the third session of Saturday. So we'll move into Sunday. The fourth session is called The Virus. American popular culture in Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, the Soviet Union, and the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Yeah, this is where we have a lot of fun while we are making a very important political point and historical point and understanding history differently. So this is taken from my forthcoming book, Blood and Freedom, Global History of the United States, which will be published next year by Grove Atlantic. This material has not been presented publicly until November in Los Angeles. So the people there will be the first to hear this. There's been snippets of it here and there, but I will present the full work on this. So this is the history of American popular culture in authoritarian regimes around the world over the last 100 years. In my research, what I found was just a tremendous amount of attraction to American popular culture, in particular things like jazz and fashion and Hollywood movies and American slang among ordinary people who lived under authoritarian regimes in Nazi Germany, in Imperial Japan, in the Soviet Union, and across the Middle East in Islamic republics, especially in Iran. And then most importantly, what I found was there was always this civil war, not just a fight, a civil war in which people were thrown into prisons or killed in the streets because they liked to listen to jazz or hip hop.
Yep.
That all of those regimes considered American popular culture to be an existential threat as great or greater than what the U.S. military posed. That they understood that if the people are more interested in dancing and sex and dressing up and going to nightclubs than in serving the country, their regime is hopeless. It's doomed. So you see that today with the mullahs all across the Middle East. They issue fatwas daily, literally, against things like Kim Kardashian and T-shirts and tattoos and piercings.
Well, there's an interesting question that comes up there. American popular culture then and now. Maybe this is just, the consequence of getting older. People observe what they see as degradation in popular culture. Mm-hmm. And now, I don't know if you saw it, but holy shit, MTV just did the VMAs. I guess they still do this. Mm-hmm. Every teenage opinion shaper, opinion shapers of teenagers in America, gets up there and gives this, left-wing politically laced speech. I'm looking at what popular culture is today versus what it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, when we're talking about, Nazi Germany and the impact on the Soviet Union. And I'm saying, what is it still any good? Does this lesson extend into the 21st century?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, the political actors have tried to, insert their ideas into popular culture from the beginning. So you had, in the 1920s and 30s, you had communists who were screenwriters who, put left-wing messages into some Hollywood movies. And, you had people on the right, of course, doing the same thing. So conservatives would put their ideas, in Hollywood movies or even in some popular music, in popular songs in the 40s and 50s, et cetera. That tends to be less important, actually, and less it has less influence in authoritarian regimes. And it's not what I'm talking about. So what I'm talking about are songs that are most popular, which tend to be not political at all in the way we think of politics. They tend to be about things like partying and sex and drinking and self-aggrandizement and individualism and the self and what I like and who I am and what I want. If you listen to the top 20 hip-hop songs right now, I guarantee you that's what you're going to hear. You're not going to hear any sort of left-wing messages or very few left-wing messages or any political messages at all inserted into the lyrics. I know this because this is what my son listens to, and so I actually know what's popular in hip hop now. And it's the same as really what the blues was in the 1920s and 30s, which was largely about drinking and fornicating.
Right. Yeah, I asked that question because I'm almost wondering if there's a useful way to sort or categorize what aspects or what types of media in popular culture are actually useful for the liberation of other people. Or is there a hierarchy? Maybe hip hop would be closer to the top. Maybe, what Hollywood puts out would be further down the list as far as the liberation quality that it might have.
Yeah. When Hollywood puts out movies promoting the family and patriotism and hard work, which it often does, that's not a threat to the Iranian regime because they want exactly the same things, don't they, among their citizens? Yeah, I was just talking to Dave Smith on my podcast. I just interviewed him, and He's in the latest episode of Unregistered, and he's very political in his stand-up acts. He's a comedian in New York, and he's very, very political. And I told him, I said, look, that's all great, and don't stop doing that. But I think that's actually less important in what you do than the jokes that are not political. I think the jokes that are not political, that simply ask questions or deal with questions that you're not supposed to raise at all in this society, that's what's really subversive. What you're doing that's the most subversive is simply saying things, making fun of things that you're not that are considered to be sacred. Now, I know a lot of that's political, but I think that comedians who talk about sex in ways you're not supposed to talk about sex, who talk about race in ways you're not supposed to talk about race, but not explicitly politically, are the ones who do the most damage to authoritarianism. They're the ones who really widen what I call the margin of freedom in societies. If the Soviet Union were still around, Stalin were still around, and he heard Dave Smith's act now, I think he'd be less concerned about what Dave has to say about the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
Than simply a person standing on stage who seems free to talk about whatever he wants to talk about, which is what comedians are, essentially. At least that's what they represent. Just feeling entitled to speak publicly about whatever you want, regardless of social norms or laws, is what's most threatening to rulers, to the heads of state.
Well, that's actually one of the reasons why I think Dave should be highlighted, because from what I see, he's becoming a rare breed. Most of the comedy that I see, it follows a formula. People are working with a lot of safe material. You know what the safe topics are. There aren't a lot of trailblazers that come to mind compared to this mass of people who are very, very successful in that industry following a certain type of narrative, right? Like Dave Smith, Dave Angelo is another one. He's been on my show. They stand out more and more, unfortunately, as people who are willing to go against a kind of safe comedy grain. Yeah,
again, so I agree with Dave on most things, politically. So it's this is not my criticism. I'm not criticizing him at all. I told him, and I would continue to tell him to do exactly what he's doing. I'm just saying that I think that when Richard Pryor talked about the differences between ways in which black people talk about sex and white people talk about sex, for instance, in 1979 in his live in concert movie, that did more to change this culture for the better than any explicitly political statement by anyone.
I think all it has to be is thought-provoking, right? Like, he can do something outside of that, not hitting people over the head with like libertarian principles, but just being willing to go out of bounds in the ways he is. And I think a lot of that is driven by the ideas and the worldview that he has, where it creates a more exciting performance than somebody like, say, Trevor Noah, who has to follow a very, very strict and managed kind of formula.
Yeah,
that's the difference. And politics is a part of that. It's not the central part of it, but I think it's an important consideration, is the worldview.
Yeah, so what Dave does, and I said this in the interview, he stands every night. He stands up in front of an audience that, if they don't know him, they hate his guts.
Right.
They hate his guts, or they assume he's evil or sociopathic, something, right? That's, once they get a whiff of his politics, people in New York City, right? People who go to comedy clubs in New York City overwhelmingly will assume that he's a bad guy, a bad person.
You get on stage, you just mention Trump. Like, I was watching the news the other day and Trump's on, and they're already like, what? Do you hate him? You better say you hate him soon. Are you on my team? If you're not on my team, I want you out of here. Like, what? And you're like, Jesus, calm down. Like, take a breath. That's my advice to all you people who hate Trump. Just take a fucking breath. You're blowing it. You're all overplaying your hand. You're making him look better. I hope they get that. Right away, it was like, Trump's Hitler. The second he came out, Trump is Hitler. I've heard that so many times now, that Trump is Hitler. I swear, if he's anything short of Hitler, I'm going to be like, he did a pretty good job. That's what you guys have done. Congratulations. And I'll be like, Trump was pretty good. And you'll be like, pretty good? He gassed 20,000 people. I'll be like, only 20,000. You guys were making it out like it was going to be a whole thing, and then Hitler, you were an alarmist, really, at the end of the day.
So he has to not only make them laugh, he has to get them to like him in 10 or 20 minutes. So he's fighting for his life. doing this. And that's real courage. All these people who go on college campuses and talk about their oppression because they're a member of some identity and talk about how brave they are for doing this. It just, there's nothing courageous about that at all. It's completely preaching to the choir. Dave is doing something that's just incredibly brave, which is, as I said, standing in front of people and saying exactly the opposite of what they want to hear. It's that freedom that he exhibits. It's not the content of what he's saying so much. It's just the freedom. He's saying, look, I am going to say whatever I want to say. And it's that spirit. That's what I'm getting at. That's the spirit that animates all of the popular culture I'm talking about. That's the spirit that invented jazz music. Jazz music is the music of improvisation. It's a music that moves outside of the boundaries, the structures of Western classical music. The individual solo is the centerpiece of a jazz song. That's what, right? And it's individualist in that way. It's saying, I'm going to take this song that we're playing right now, and I'm going to make it what I want. I'm going to make it something new that's entirely my own thing, and then we'll come back together and play the chorus together. But right now, for the next 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to use the structure of this song and fly with it all by myself. And that's what Dave's doing. So it's that spirit. It's not the content. It's not the particular notes that are played or the words that are spoken. This is rare among people, isn't it? People who don't care enough about social norms and mores to constrain themselves. They are simply going to live free.
Yeah, I think it's an impulse that's very strong. And while we've been talking about this, I think I can refine and maybe better articulate the thought I was having that's based on this observation I've seen over the last couple of years. The positive qualities, individualism, self-assertion, going against the grain. It seems like there has been a real effort and some success in entertainment media that serves a political agenda, the mainstream media, the comedy business, to almost harness that kind of individualism or I'm a rebel, to basically use it to feed establishment interests in a way that I haven't seen done before. So a quick example that I can think of, I was just horrified by a trailer. I can't believe this is a real thing. Al Gore has a movie coming out called An Inconvenient Truth Part 2 or something like that, something to that effect. And in the trailer, if you're standing up, if you're fighting for global warming, you're fucking renegade, right? You're a change maker. Well, you're a truth seeker.
You're also brave.
You're very brave. It's like if you had the courage to condemn white supremacy on Facebook in August, you're a fucking hero.
There you go. Yeah, so that's what I'm getting at. So there's this amazing thing where people seem to believe stating the status quo or affirming the status quo is somehow courageous. They somehow think that the status quo is actually the minority view, right?
That's exactly it.
So saying white supremacy is evil is, hello everybody, that is the dominant view in this country. There are very, very few people. There's a tiny minority that would differ from that at all. Yet, as you're saying, to say that, people act as if it's an act of courage. This is one of the reasons I just refuse. I refuse to denounce or moralize or even criticize the actual Nazis and actual Klansmen, okay, at Charlottesville. Why? It is obvious, first of all, that I have no sympathy whatsoever with their actual politics, A, and B, you don't need me to say that because everybody and their uncle and grandmother is shouting at them about how evil they are. And C, I don't do it because it's the cheapest form of virtue signaling there is.
Right.
It is nothing. It contributes nothing to the world except this little peep that you are a good person and better than those guys. Fourth thing that I hate about this this sort of ritual denunciation of Nazis and the Klan is that it's anti-intellectual. It's ahistorical. It serves the purpose of narrowing discourse, acceptable political discourse in our society, because they don't actually know what those guys in Charlottesville really think. Sure, if you're carrying a Nazi flag, there's got to be you have some sympathy at least with the Nazi regime in Germany in the 1930s. But do we know how much of actual Nazi politics those guys in Charlottesville share? Do we even know? Do we even know
Yeah.
what Nazi Germany was? I said on Twitter the other day, cryptically, but I think a lot of people caught my meaning. I said even Hitler wasn't Hitler.
Yes.
You get it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hitler. So I've spent the last 2 years. I spent much of the last 2 years researching Nazi Germany. Okay.
Yeah.
And I knew quite a lot going into it. But it's so much more complicated. And Hitler was so much less of Hitler than we believe in many, many ways that I'm writing about. And it's not to say that there's not one thing out of his mouth in terms of political. He had some criticisms that I agree with, criticisms of the West, criticisms of World War I, of the Versailles Treaty, of what the Allies did to Germany after World War I. I completely agree with him on much of that stuff. But in terms of what he was proposing as an alternative society, as a new society, there's not one shred of it that I have any sympathy with whatsoever. It's the exact opposite of what I want. But nonetheless, the way he's been portrayed for 60 or 70 years has been a concerted effort. Here it is, Brett, to justify total war for humanitarian reasons.